سلام، خوش اومدید به 78مین شب از مجموعه در این شبها. در برنامه امروز ما درباره پدیده در واقع ریترکشن یا مرجوع شدن مقالات علمی منتشر شده در رسانه‌های علمی صحبت می‌کنیم. در ژورنال‌های علمی مقالاتی که بعد از عبور از پروسه و روند ارزشیابی موسوم به پیر ریویو یا بازبینی همرده‌ها به دلایل مختلف از چرخه نشر خارج میشن و باطل میشن و مرجوع میشن. توی سال‌های اخیر تعداد این مقالات یا حداقل تعداد گزارش‌هایی که از این مرجوع شدن‌ها وجود داره افزایش پیدا کرده. در پایان سال میلادی گذشته گزارشی که نیچر منتشر کرده بود نشون میدادش که این عدد به طور قابل توجهی افزایش یافته، به خصوص در کشورهای در حال توسعه از جمله ایران. بهترین کسی که میتونست در واقع برای درک این موضوع و دلایل این به ما کمک کنه ایوان اورانسکی هستش، یکی از بنیانگذاران سایت Retraction Watch. Retraction Watch سایتی است که از زمان تأسیس خودش نقش مهم و جدی رو برای دنبال کردن مرجوع شدن مقالات علمی بازی کرده و تأثیر مهمی رو هم تو فضای انتشارات علم داشته و هم در فضای در واقع روزنامه نگاری علم. این گفتگوی من با ایوان رو ببینید، امیدوارم که در واقع مطالب اون کمک بکنه به ما و به خصوص در فضای ایران که با دقت بیشتری به مسئله ریترکشن و اهمیتش توجه بکنیم. من در واقع گفتگوم با ایوان رو با این نکته شروع کردم که انگیزه و دلایلی که باعث شدش که در بین انبوه سوژه هایی که وجود داره او و همکارانش به سراغ مسئله مرجوع شدن مقالات علمی برن چی بود، چگونه در واقع این ایده اساسا شکل گرفت که بعدا تبدیل شد به اون چیزی که الان میبینیم. پاسخ ایوان رو ببینیم.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's really nice to be here. So I always want to make it clear I'm the co-founder of Retraction Watch, or a co-founder of Retraction Watch. Adam Marcus and I co-founded, and it was really because of his work that I had the idea. So Adam, like me, is a medical journalist, mostly for trade audience, professional audience, and he had broken a big story around 2008, end of 2008, beginning of 2009, about someone named Scott Rubin who had faked the data in more than something like 25 papers. We didn't know how many papers at the time, but pretty big deal. And Scott Rubin ended up going to federal prison here in the US for that, and also paid restitution, and again had more than 24 retractions. But Adam had broken this story, and it made me think that there were all these retractions hiding in plain sight, that there was a good story behind at least some of them. And so why not, as journalists, look at that? We also noticed that, retraction notices were very unclear. They sometimes were even wrong or misleading. So we thought that's a transparency problem. Let's look into that. And I should clarify one thing, which is that although I understand the confusion that a lot of people have, we actually don't routinely or even very often look for papers that should be retracted. We are really looking at the process of retraction. Mm-hmm. And so what we end up reporting on cases that should be retracted because they're part of a larger body of work. Or like, for example, today, as you and I are talking, we just put up a post about some very strange behavior in an economics paper with some data. And, I'm not going to say it should be retracted because that's not our place, but clearly a lot of the critics we spoke to have a lot of questions about the paper. And so we launched it in August of 2010, and we've been going strong, much more strongly than we thought we would, ever since.
اما زمانی که شما به گزارشگری از در واقع ریترکشن ها میپردازید یا مرجوع شدن ها، به طور طبیعی نوری رو میندازیم روی فضایی که شاید بعضی دوست نداشته باشن ببینیم، از جمله خود سیستم انتشارات علمی و کسانی که به دلایل مختلف از جمله تقلب و امثال اون در واقع وارد این پروسه شدن. از ایوان پرسیدم که واکنشی که دریافت کرده در هم از سیستم نشر با توجه به که زندگی اونها رو خیلی سخت‌تر کرده و هم از جامعه علمی و جامعه روزنامه‌نگاری علمی چی بوده؟
Well, look, Pori, I always leave it to other people to say whether we've had an impact or not, and they're welcome to, provide their rationale. I will say I like to be evidence-based about it, and one of a paper that came out last year sometime was really, it made me smile for obvious reasons. It actually showed that if you compared retractions that we covered, that we wrote about on Retraction Watch, that hadn't been sort of immediate. In other words, immediate retractions were excluded. But if you look at retractions that take a little while, which is most of them, the act of our reporting on it seemed to have at least be correlated, at least linked to, associated with, it being that paper being cited less often, which is sort of an interesting. That's not a measure of impact that I think a lot of journalists usually use, but it's something that we were looking at. The reaction has been varied to our work, as you would expect. I think early on, people really weren't sure what to do with it. They really weren't sure what to make of it. People who knew me and Adam one way or the other and knew of our work understood very quickly this wasn't about destroying science or making people question science. Other people who didn't know our work, they thought that might be the case, and I can actually understand that. A lot of what we write about and have written about has been taken up by people who I think are sometimes inclined to destroy institutions, and I can appreciate that. I appreciate that risk. But overall, I have to say that people have been somewhere between cheering us on and saying, thank you so much for doing this. And that's a lot of journalists have said that. Well, I think, there are certainly people in scientific publishing and elsewhere in science who may kind of wish that we weren't necessary, or recognize that we were necessary. I'm sure there are some that wish that we didn't exist, and that's up to them. But honestly, most reactions we've received have been quite positive. Even people whose employers were writing about. Many of them, thousands of them, have signed up for our email alerts and things like that. So even if they have to sort of grit their teeth when they read us, they understand that this, is an important issue to talk about. I think sometimes others in the community who are very frustrated with the pace of change and with the fact that publishers in particular don't seem very interested in correcting the record, they kind of come to us and hope that we will, maybe shame publishers or others into doing something. And certainly public scrutiny can do that. But I think that what we're hoping to do is to have everyone think about these issues and maybe think differently about them. And, I would like to think that one of the effects of our work has not necessarily been direct in terms of leading to change, although I hope that some of our work has led to change. But what it has done is show a lot of others the importance of these issues. When we first started, Adam and I, people didn't really talk about these issues very much. Sometimes they did. And about once a year, there was some big scandal that journalists would pay attention to. Now, I don't think you can go a week without a big scandal happening around the world. And given the number of times reporters call me for comment or just for understanding what they're looking at or helping them with a story, I've done many webinars for reporters on how to cover these issues. I have to think that, we gave some people an idea to cover this more. And if that's the case, well, then great. That's part of our larger mission, actually. It creates a lot of competition for us.
یکی از دیگه از مسائلی که خیلی مهم هستش بهش توجه میکنیم وقتی که در واقع از نظر آماری نگاه میکنیم این هستش که در سالهای اخیر تعداد مقالاتی که در واقع مرجوع شدن از سوی نشریات مهم به طور چشمگیری افزایش پیدا کرده. اما دلیل این چه میتونه باشه؟ آیا به خاطر افزایش نظارت هستش، آیا نقش فناوری درش بازی میکنه، یا اینکه نه واقعا سیستم تحقیقاتی و پژوهشی فرایندی رو ایجاد کرده که ما شاهد تعداد بیشتری از کسانی هستیم که از این سیستم سوء استفاده میکنن.
It's very clear to us that it's the work of the sleuths. In other words, the people really doing the examination and the scrutiny. People like Elizabeth Bick, most recently Sholto David has become quite prominent, and there are any number. There are dozens of them. We have a whole page on our website about the sleuths. You can actually read about a lot of them there. So that's clearly what is responsible for the growth in retractions. Now, that's a sort of proximal cause. That's a direct cause. What's behind that, I think, is just more people able to do that kind of work. Keep in mind that 25 years ago, you couldn't bring up every article on your website, on your laptop or on your screen here and compare it to another document, or look at the images or blow them up and do things like that are necessary. So it stands to reason that there will be more retractions now that people can do that, and they have those tools. Now, in terms of whether or not there is more misconduct, I think it's a great question, and one that is very difficult to answer because we don't really have a good historical record. We do know that paper mills have become more active, although I always hasten to add that paper mills are not new. There were two big stories in The Economist and in Science Magazine more than a decade ago, so in 2013, pointing out, and really reporting on these issues. So have they grown? Probably, but they were pretty powerful then. Which is why a lot of the retractions you're seeing are still of older papers. So I think it's an open question, but there is no question in terms of scrutiny leading to more retractions. And the retraction figures have, of course, grown dramatically. We now have more than 50,000 retractions in the scientific literature. And that last year there were more than 10,000, which is literally 25 times more than there were from journals the year we launched in 2010.
معمولا ما زمانی که از پیر ریویو هم صحبت میکنیم یه نوع استاندارد فعلا طلایی بشه بهش گفتش در سیستم نشر هستش، اما با وجود این زمانی که به مواردی که مرجوع شدن و مواردی که بررسی شدن نگاه میکنیم به نظر میرسه که این سیستم دچار مشکل هستش. سوالی که از ایوان مطرح کردم این هستش که آیا این در واقع تخلفات یا این آن چیزی که منجر به این میشه که یک مقاله از توی فرایند پیر ریویو رد بشه و در نهایت برسه به اونجایی که حالا بعداً متوجه بشیم که در واقع نیازمند اینه که مرجوع بشه، اطلاعاتش درست نبوده یا هر چیز دیگه، دلیلش چیه؟ آیا بازیگران بد حوزه تحقیق و پژوهش هستن که عامل اصلی این هستن، یا اینکه خود سیستم ادیتوریال اساساً در ژورنال‌های علمی در حفره‌هایی رو داره، لوپ‌هول‌هایی رو داره که اجازه میده که چنین خطاهایی اتفاق بیفته، یا عوامل دیگه‌ای درش نقش دارن؟
Well, let me answer by saying that about 2/3 of the time, retractions are for misconduct, right? So that's falsification, meaning you're making the data look better than they really are, fabrication, making it up, or plagiarism, something that would be considered misconduct. It's about 2/3 of the time. And so the reason why, I think what you're asking is sort of, why is that getting through the system? And the answer is really that peer review is a very porous system. It has always been that way. It may be getting worse because there are so many papers to peer review and so few qualified people, relatively speaking. But I think, there are failures at every stage, right? And so you can sort of think about it like a Swiss cheese model, which of course is porous in the sense of having holes in it. And, this is something that I think people are starting to really talk about, but it's something that we, and frankly others long before we were around, have talked about how the peer review system is, it's very porous. It's flawed. It's still pretty good in the sense that I think we should continue it, but we shouldn't claim that so many papers are peer reviewed when in fact what peer review means is dramatically different among different fields, different publishers, different journals. So this is really, you're dealing with a very porous system, and that's a very uncomfortable reality for people. Because we have all been brought up on this idea that peer review somehow means it is correct, that it is, black and white. One is correct and one is not correct. All it means is that some people have looked at it, and so it has some percentage greater likelihood of standing up, of holding up. But what that percentage is very far from 100.
شاید سوال دیگه ای که مطرح باشه اینه که بر اساس آن چیزی که می‌بینیم آیا ما نیازمند نوعی اصلاحات، ریفرم یا تغییر جدی در فرایند ارزشگذاری مقالات علمی و به خصوص وزنی که به پیر ریویو و سیستم بازبینی همرده ها میدیم داریم، یا اینکه نه این سیستم فعلا خوبه ولی فقط باید مواظب باشیم.
Well, I think we should do both, but I think it's probably, if we had to pick one, I think looking at the incentive structure and the assessment exercise is probably more important, because everything flows from that, right? So if incentives are based on publications and citations, which we know they are,
yes,
really to a much higher extent than they should be, in my opinion. Adam and Alison Obrightis, who's the Retraction Watch, research director, and who's built our database, actually has a PhD. Her thesis was about retractions. It's the most qualified person in the world. Adam, Alison, and I co-authored an editorial in the BMJ last summer, talking about how institutional rankings, right? So university rankings lead to these problems very, very clearly, and also in a very predictable way. So if citations are, give or take a third or even 50% of what counts in terms of, incentives and what counts in terms of the rankings, well, then everyone's going to do everything they can to get cited, which means doing everything they can to get published. So we need to take a hard look at that. As you and I are talking, just recently in the last week or so, DORA came out. This is, of course, a group that has been campaigning against the use of impact factor, a very flawed metric, to rank journals and to think about incentives and rank universities. They came out with a much more, granular sort of, here's how we might do assessment much better. And I think that's a good place to start. So that's all true. However, there will always be peer review, and there will always be a need for it. And so we need to be much more honest about what peer review can and can't do. I don't think it's necessarily about fixing it as much as being honest about it.
Yes.
And also not trying to shove literally 3 million manuscripts through peer review every year. There is just no way. When you start to think about 3 million papers times 2 or 3 peer reviewers times, on average, at least 4 hours for a good review, and probably more. And by the way, if it gets rejected, you got to multiply that again by how many times. When you start to do that math, it just doesn't work. And so instead of trying to claim that there are 3 million, properly peer-reviewed papers every year, let's be honest about that. Maybe have fewer that are peer-reviewed, but more that are on, say, preprint servers and just available, and have people look at it then.
نکته دیگه که وجود داره، حداقل بر مبنای مواردی که آمارش منتشر میشه، از جمله مقاله‌ای که در پایان سال گذشته میلادی نیچر منتشر کرد، ما در همه جای دنیا شاهد ریترکشن هستیم، اما زمانی که این وارد کشورهای در حال توسعه میشه، از جمله ایران، از جمله کشورهای منطقه ما، شاهد این هستیم که به طور چشمگیری افزایش پیدا میکنه. در صدر کشورهایی که بیشترین ریترکشن رو داشتن در سالهای قبل، در 20 سال قبل، کشورهای در حال توسعه بودن، از جمله ایران در اون فهرست وجود داشتش. من سعی کردم دو سه تا سوال با هم ترکیب بکنم و از آیوان بپرسم که اولا چرا فکر میکنه که چنین اتفاقی در این کشورهای در حال توسعه در حال رخ دادن هست، و دوم اینکه با توجه به اینکه انجام دادن پروژه‌ای مثل ریترکشن واچ نیازمند یه سری آزادی‌ها و همینطور زیرساخت‌های متفاوتی هستش که شاید در دسترس خیلی‌ها در کشورهای در حال توسعه نباشه، چه توصیه‌ای داره برای روزنامه‌نگارها و اینکه اساساً آیا پروژه‌ای مثل پروژه ریترکشن واچ نسبت به همکاری با کسانی که به طور مستقل به خصوص در این کشورها فعالیت میکنند آمادگی داره و چنین فرصتی رو برای همکاری‌های مشترک در واقع فراهم میکنه یا نه؟
Sure, those are fairly distinct questions,
yes,
but also but somewhat related in that what you're talking about really is resources and access to resources. Yes. And I think it goes beyond that, if I may. I think particularly for journalists, but I think for anyone in some of those countries, some of them, again, not all of them. Sometimes it's literally just a resource issue. But in a lot of other cases, and I would put Iran in this situation, there isn't really press freedom. I don't have to tell you that. And that's probably being very kind. I think that, the press is, people can be arrested and terrible things can happen. So when you criticize, I'm, frankly, quite privileged in many ways. I mean, literally my upbringing, but also in terms of my work. I am frankly well paid. Don't tell my day job, but I think I'm pretty well paid. I have support. I have resources. Retraction Watch is separate from my regular work, so I don't have to worry that my bosses, the people who determine my career, will be upset that something is critical of academia or critical of scientific publishing. Most people, most journalists are not, able to have all that good luck or privilege, fortune, and some have none of it at all. That's also true of scientists, right? And so scientists who try and buck the system in certain places are not going to, unfortunately, they're not going to fare well. In fact, they're probably going to face retaliation. And I think to get back to the question about incentives, I think it's about incentives in every country.
Yes.
And so when you have again, mostly the West, sort of developed countries, wealthy countries, I think we should just call them what they are. Yes, it's still very competitive. It's still very difficult to get grants, but there is just more money. There's more funding, and there's a better, way to do not way to do science, but it's easier, right? There are fewer barriers, and so it's not surprising that in places that are trying to get into the national rankings or the university rankings within their country, that they would try and compete even harder. It creates even worse incentives. So that's not surprising. But if you look at most of the who's created those incentive structures and who's created the ranking systems, that's actually still the West, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
Yes, there's the Shanghai ranking, but China, frankly, is now outstripping everybody, not surprisingly, in terms of all those rankings. So it's a complex, and I don't have 3 hours to, and you don't want to listen for 3 hours, but it's a complex geopolitical problem, and you end up punishing people even more who are already, and we're very conscious of this, who are already really at a disadvantage, and that's not fair.
Yeah.
Now, and the good news is that Retraction Watch is happy to, partner and work with anyone. And we do that in several different ways. One is that our database of retractions is freely available, especially now that it has been acquired by another nonprofit, Crossref. Anyone around the world can literally press a button, click on a link, and they get the entire database. They can look at what's going on in their country, compare it, look for stories. People are doing that all the time. We get notes about stories. That's one way. Another way is we speak to reporters from around the world all the time, either for quotation or just to help them with stories. And again, I mentioned webinars and things. We also partner with other news organizations. They tend to be places we have contacts that are, likely in English, because that's the only language that our team universally speaks, although we have someone who is in Denmark and speaks a few different languages. But we're happy to partner with any groups. Beyond advice and beyond providing a resource, actually doing the work obviously requires resources, and we can, sort of take that another time in terms of, how that works. But we're happy to work with anyone, and we make everything available, even in countries where we know that people cannot see Retraction Watch because we're blocked or because WordPress is blocked. So we're happy to speak to people all the time, and I'm literally talking to people around the world, every week, which is, very gratifying.
یکی از موضوعاتی که امروزا همه در هر حوزه در موردش صحبت میکنن بحث AI هست، یا حداقل مدل‌های تولید محتوا بر مبنای سیستم‌های بزرگ زبانی، به طور مشخص چت جی پی تی و امثال اون. از آنها پرسیدم که دیدگاهش در رابطه با تأثیری که چنین فناوری میتونه در دو موضوع داشته باشه. یکی اینکه کمک بکنه به کسانی که میخوان تقلب بکنن و در واقع دور بزنن سیستم رو، و همینطور در رابطه با اینکه آیا ممکنه که کمک بکنه که جلوگیری بکنه از چنین روندهایی و کلا دیدگاهش رو به عنوان یه ناظری که داره این موضوع رو دنبال میکنه در رابطه با نقشی که چنین فناوری میتونه بازی بکنه پرسیدم.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be clear. I'm not. This is very far from my actual expertise in terms of a subject. I can describe what we've seen though, and one part of it that I think is important, but probably not going to be an issue forever, is that AI, ChatGPT in particular, they hallucinate references, right? Exactly. So they create references that don't exist. That's strange. That should be findable though, because if you just check it against existing references, that there's actually technology that doesn't require AI that would do that. Clearly, there are authors who are using AI. There's a group in France, Guillaume Cabanach and Cyril Lebay and some other colleagues. They are finding these strange phrases of all kinds, including regenerate response, when clearly people are copying and pasting the entire thing. I think that is it's a problem. We need to deal with it, but probably AI or people are going to be smart enough to sort of work their way around that. I think we have to, again, be honest about it. I think we have to look at how AI might be able to actually find some of these problems. But that's going to be an arms race, and it's always an arms race. And what I would say about AI is the same thing I would say about any issue that people suddenly fixate on in scientific publishing. So we've seen this recently with AI, but right after that, there was plagiarism, right? And suddenly everyone was looking for plagiarism. They're still doing it. Before that, and now again, people are looking at image manipulation, right? So there's always something that is affecting it. Some of it is related to AI, some of it isn't. I think we need to take a step back, right? And think about the bigger issues and the fact that this is all part of one big misconduct problem. And again, look back at the incentives, because, and journalists love to do this, and I consider myself, in this category. The shiny object is the thing that gets the attention. And if we only fixate on the shiny object, the famous video of the gorilla and the basketball, right? The gorilla is just going to keep walking back and forth, and it's going to be more gorillas. It's going to be a much more dangerous gorilla, not a friendly gorilla with a suit on. And, we're going to all be caught unawares. All of this is preventable, or at least all of it is predictable. Whether it's preventable is separate. And we need to take that into account and have some more humility about what we're doing.
خیلی ممنون از اینکه گفتگوی من با ایوان رو تماشا کردید. امیدوارم که بخشایی از اون برای شما، به خصوص اگر در فضای حرفه‌ای هستید، فضای آکادمیک و همینطور فضای ژورنالیسم علم، جالب بوده باشه یا الهام بخش بوده باشه که در واقع فعالیتایی رو بکنیم که این مسئله رو در حوزه خودمون حداقل نوعی پاسخ بهش بدیم. و ممنون از اینکه بیننده در این شب‌ها هستید. من سعی می‌کنم در این شب‌ها رو به طور نیمه منظم به روز بکنم و سعی می‌کنم عمده تمرکزم رو در واقع فعلا بذارم روی بخشی که حالا اسم موقت اسپات لایت رو روش گذاشتیم، بخشی که شامل گفتگوهایی با دانشمندان و افراد فعال در حوزه علم و رسانه علم هستش. اگر علاقه‌مند هستید و فکر می‌کنید مفید هست، ممنون میشم به دوستانتون معرفی کنید. در یوتیوب میتونید مشترک بشید و طبیعتاً انتشارش به هر شکلی که صلاح میدونین و بازپخشش به هر شکلی که صلاح میدونین باعث خوشحالی من هستش. موفق باشید تا شب دیگر در این شب‌ها.